start part 1. How does an empire tremble without a single gunshot? How does history change when the loudest weapon is a whisper? In the shadows of colonial Boston, while crowds shouted and soldiers marched, one quiet man pulled invisible strings. His name was Sam Adams, and the night the tea vanished into the harbor was only the beginning. Boston in the 1760s was a city that breathed tension. You could feel it in the narrow streets, hear it in the creak of wooden docks, smell it in the salt air mixed with anger. Ships arrived daily from across the Atlantic, carrying goods, soldiers, and laws that no one in the colonies had voted for. To the British Crown, Boston was just another colonial port. To the people who lived there, it was home, and it was being squeezed dry. Sam Adams walked these streets every day. He did not look like a revolutionary. He was not tall or intimidating. He wore simple clothes, often slightly worn, and moved with an unhurried calm. Many dismissed him as a failed businessman, a man who could not hold on to money or success. But while others measured worth in coins and property, Sam Adams dealt in ideas, and ideas were far more dangerous. He was born into Boston, into its churches, its meeting halls, its arguments. From a young age, he learned that words mattered. A sentence, carefully spoken, could travel faster than any soldier. By the time British taxes began piling up like bricks on colonial backs, Adams was already listening more than he spoke. Listening to dockworkers angry about lost wages. Listening to merchants furious over trade restrictions. Listening to ordinary families who wondered why a king 3,000 miles away decided how they lived. The Stamp Act came first, and Boston erupted. Newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards required an official stamp that cost money. To Parliament it was a simple way to raise revenue. To the colonists it was an insult. They had no representatives in Britain. No voice. No vote. Sam Adams watched the protests carefully. He noticed something important. Anger alone burned hot, but it burned out quickly. What it needed was direction. In small rooms above taverns and in back corners of printing shops, Adams began to gather men who felt the same quiet rage he did. They did not meet under banners or slogans. They met in whispers. These gatherings would later be known as the Sons of Liberty, but at first, they were simply neighbors asking a dangerous question. What if we said no? Sam Adams rarely spoke first in these meetings. He waited. He let others vent, curse the crown, dream aloud of rebellion. Then, when the room grew quiet, he would speak softly, calmly, as if reasoning with history itself. Violence, he said, would only justify British crackdowns. Chaos would turn public opinion against them. What they needed was unity and symbolism. An act so clear that no one could misunderstand its meaning. British soldiers began appearing more frequently in Boston. Red coats patrolled the streets, muskets resting against their shoulders, bayonets glinting in the sun. Officially they were there to keep order. Unofficially they were a reminder. The empire was watching. Every confrontation carried the risk of bloodshed. Adams knew that a single violent incident could undo years of careful persuasion. Then violence came anyway. The Boston Massacre shattered the fragile calm. A confrontation between civilians and British soldiers ended with gunfire. 5 colonists lay dead in the snow. Boston erupted in grief and fury. Crowds demanded revenge. Some called for open war. Sam Adams stood at the edge of the chaos and made a decision that would define his legacy. He would not let anger take control. Instead of inciting mobs, Adams demanded justice through words. He insisted on a fair trial for the soldiers, even though many colonists hated that idea. To some, it looked like weakness. In reality, it was strategy. A fair trial showed the world that the colonies were guided by principles, not bloodlust. It also exposed British authority as fragile, dependent on force rather than consent. Behind the scenes, Adams wrote constantly. Letters, pamphlets, newspaper articles published under false names. Each piece carried the same quiet message. Liberty was not a gift from kings, it was a right. He avoided dramatic language, choosing reason over rage. Ordinary people read his words and felt understood. Not commanded. Not manipulated. Understood. Years passed, and tension never faded. Parliament repealed some taxes, then introduced new ones. Each compromise felt temporary, like a breath before another blow. Then came the Tea Act. On paper it made British tea cheaper in the colonies. But Sam Adams saw through it instantly. This was not generosity, it was a trap. By buying the tea, colonists would be accepting Parliament's right to tax them without representation. Boston Harbor filled with ships carrying tea. Merchants refused to unload it. Meetings grew larger, louder. Thousands gathered to debate what should be done. At the center of these meetings stood Sam Adams, calm as ever. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He asked questions. If the tea was unloaded, what message would that send? If it was returned, would the Crown allow it? What choice did Boston truly have? Privately, Adams was already planning for the answer everyone feared but few dared to say out loud. Secret meetings resumed. Not in the open halls this time, but in quiet rooms lit by candles. Disguises were discussed. Taming. Discipline. Adams insisted on one rule above all others. No harm to any person. No theft. No personal profit. This was not chaos. It was theater, with history as its audience. On the night of December 16, 1773, Adams stood before a massive crowd and spoke words that sounded almost ordinary. He declared that the meeting could do nothing more to save the country. To most listeners, it sounded like defeat. To those who knew him well, it was a signal. Men moved through the streets, faces darkened, clothes altered to resemble Mohawk Indians. Ships sat silently in the harbor, unaware that they were about to become symbols etched into history. Sam Adams did not join them on the ships. He stayed behind. His work was already done. As crates of tea were smashed and thrown into the black water, the Empire lost something far more valuable than cargo. It lost control of the narrative. By morning, Boston was changed forever. And Sam Adams, still quiet, still underestimated, watched as his idea rippled outward, toward revolution. Part 2. Morning broke over Boston Harbor with an uneasy silence. The water still smelled of tea, sharp and bitter, clinging to the docks like an accusation. Ships sat lighter in the water, their holds empty, their purpose erased overnight. Word traveled quickly, faster than any official report ever could. By the time the sun rose fully, Boston already knew what it had done, and what it might now face. Sam Adams woke early that morning. There was no celebration in his home, no sense of victory. He understood something most men did not. The destruction of the tea was not an ending. It was an invitation. An invitation for the British Empire to respond. He walked the streets as usual, greeting neighbors, listening more than speaking. People looked at each other differently now. Some with pride, others with fear. Mothers worried about soldiers storming through their doors. Merchants wondered if their livelihoods had just been destroyed. Dockworkers whispered about war. Adams absorbed it all, storing every concern, every doubt, knowing that leadership after defiance mattered just as much as the defiance itself. British officials were stunned. Never before had a colony openly destroyed property on such a scale, and with such discipline. No loot, no injuries, no drunken chaos. That detail, more than the loss of tea, unsettled them. This had not been a riot, had been a message. Within weeks, Parliament answered. The punishment was swift and crushing. Boston's port was closed. Trade stopped overnight. Ships no longer came or went. Food prices rose. Jobs disappeared. British troops flooded the city once again. New laws stripped Massachusetts of self-governance. To London, these were coercive acts. To the colonists, they were the intolerable acts. Boston began to choke. Families struggled to eat. Storefronts closed. The city felt trapped, like an animal pressed into a corner. Anger returned, hotter than before, But now it was mixed with desperation. Some men blamed Sam Adams by name. They said he had gone too far, that his ideas had brought ruin. Adams heard the accusations. He never answered them publicly. Instead, he acted. He reached beyond Boston, sending letters to other colonies, carefully describing the suffering not as Boston's punishment, but as a warning. If Parliament could do this to one city, it could do it to all. He urged unity, not rebellion, at least not yet. Support Boston, he wrote, because next time it may be your harbor. Food began arriving from neighboring colonies. Grain, livestock, supplies. Small gestures but powerful ones. For the first time, the colonies were not acting alone. Sam Adams had shifted the struggle from a local crisis to a shared cause. Inside Boston, meetings continued, though British soldiers watched closely. Adams attended many, often sitting quietly near the back. When he did speak, his voice remained measured. He reminded people why they had acted. Not out of hatred for Britain, but out of love for liberty. He urged restraint, knowing that one violent outburst could justify even harsher rule. British commanders saw him as dangerous, though frustratingly untouchable. He rarely broke laws outright. He spoke of rights, not revolution. But they knew his influence ran deep. More than once, plans were quietly discussed to arrest him. Each time public backlash made them hesitate. Adams had become too visible to remove, yet too subtle to silence. In private moments, the weight pressed heavily on him. Friends worried for his safety. Some urged him to flee Boston. He refused. Leadership, he believed, meant standing where the consequences fell hardest. As months passed, colonial leaders from across America began communicating more frequently. Committees of correspondence spread Adams's ideas far beyond Massachusetts. What began as letters became networks. What began as outrage became organization. Then came the Continental Congress. Delegates traveled long distances, carrying fears, hopes, and instructions from their colonies. Sam Adams was among them, walking into a room filled with men who would shape a nation. Some were cautious, still hoping for reconciliation. Others were already thinking of independence. Adams listened again, carefully, patiently. When he spoke, he did not demand separation from Britain. He spoke of rights, of patterns, of how power, once unchecked, never restrained itself willingly. He reminded them of Boston's suffering, not dramatically but plainly. Facts carried their own force. Outside those halls, events moved faster than debate. In Lexington and Concord, British troops marched to seize weapons. Shots were fired. No one could later agree on who fired first, but it hardly mattered. Blood had been spilled. The sound echoed far beyond Massachusetts. War had begun. Sam Adams was now labeled a traitor by the Crown. His arrest was ordered. His name appeared on lists beside men like John Hancock. British forces searched for them. Adams escaped capture more than once, slipping through towns with the help of ordinary people who believed in his cause. The quiet man had become a symbol. Yet even now, he avoided calls for revenge. He spoke instead of resolve, of discipline, of the kind of war they must fight, not just with muskets but with principles. If they lost those, he warned, victory would mean nothing. As fighting spread, Adams continued writing. His words traveled alongside soldiers, read aloud in camps, reprinted in newspapers. He framed the struggle not as rebellion but as self-defense. Not as chaos but as necessity. Years earlier he had believed ideas could change history. Now he watched them do exactly that. At a terrible cost. Boston, scarred but unbroken, stood as proof that resistance could survive punishment. The harbor no longer smelled of tea, but the memory lingered. And across 13 colonies, people began to see themselves not as subjects, but as something new. Sam Adams did not seek credit. He rarely spoke of the night the tea fell into the water. To him it was never about a single act. It was about momentum. about teaching people to believe that even an empire could be challenged, not with fire at first, but with courage and unity. And as the colonies edged closer to declaring independence, one truth became clear. The quiet mastermind had succeeded in doing what armies alone never could. He had changed how people thought. Part 3. The war changed everything, and yet, in many ways, nothing at all. Boston no longer belonged to debate halls and whispered meetings. It belonged to marching boots, ringing church bells, and the constant anxiety of occupation. British cannons pointed inward from the harbor, and the once busy streets felt tense and watchful. Sam Adams had seen this coming long before the first musket cracked in Lexington, but seeing it unfold in reality carried a heavier weight. He had always believed that ideas could spark action. Now action had ignited fire, and the fire was spreading faster than anyone could fully control. Forced to move constantly to avoid capture, Adams traveled from town to town, often at night, relying on friends and strangers alike. Farmers hid him in barns. Shopkeepers passed messages in folded paper and lowered voices. Ordinary people risked their lives to protect a man who carried no weapon, only conviction. It humbled him deeply. In the halls of the Continental Congress, the mood shifted. Early meetings had been cautious, filled with men hoping for compromise. Now the air felt different. The question was no longer whether conflict could be avoided, but whether independence could be justified, to themselves and to the world. Sam Adams sat through long debates, listening as always. When others argued that reconciliation with Britain was still possible, he did not interrupt. He waited. He understood that fear was not weakness, it was human. What mattered was what followed. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm, almost gentle. He did not glorify war. He spoke of patterns, of how every petition had been ignored, every concession met with a heavier hand. He asked a simple question. If rights could be taken away at will, what protection did any colony truly have? Silence often followed his words. Outside Congress, pamphlets circulated widely. Thomas Paine's common sense electrified the public, pushing independence from a radical idea into a popular demand. Sam Adams welcomed the shift, though he had never been one for fiery language. He recognized that movements needed both sparks and steady flames. Where others inspired passion, he anchored it with structure. As armies formed, Adams remained uneasy. He supported resistance, but he feared what war could turn into if left unchecked. He wrote tirelessly to military leaders, urging discipline. He reminded them that the world was watching. The colonies, he said, must prove they were fighting for liberty, not lawlessness. Meanwhile, the British escalated their efforts to crush dissent. Loyalists faced increasing hostility. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Adams was deeply troubled by this. He had spent his life uniting people, not tearing them apart. In private letters, he urged restraint and mercy, even toward those who opposed independence. Freedom, he believed, meant nothing if built on cruelty. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence emerged. Its words echoed many of the ideas Adams had promoted for decades. Consent of the governed. The moral case against tyranny. When the document was adopted, Adams felt no surge of triumph, only gravity. There was no turning back now. War dragged on. Supplies ran low. Morale wavered. Adams continued his work behind the scenes, serving on committees, shaping policies, resolving disputes between colonies that still struggled to trust one another fully. He had never sought the spotlight, and now that others stood in it, he was content to remain where he had always been, steadying the foundation. British forces eventually evacuated Boston, but the victory was fragile. The conflict stretched southward, then west. News arrived slowly, often carrying loss. Adams read casualty lists in silence, knowing that each name represented a family forever changed. Despite the hardships, the idea he had nurtured for years had taken root. Farmers who once saw themselves as subjects now spoke of citizenship. Colonies that once acted alone now coordinated like parts of a single body. Unity, imperfect but real, had begun to form. There were moments of doubt. Late at night, Adams questioned whether the cost was too high. Whether a man who believed so deeply in words should bear responsibility for a war fought with bullets. But each time he wavered, he returned to the same conclusion: submission would have been worse. He never claimed authorship of the revolution. History would later highlight generals and speeches and battles. Sam Adams remained what he had always been, a force moving just beneath the surface, guiding currents rather than commanding waves. As the war continued, one thing became undeniable. The empire had underestimated the power of quiet leadership. It had prepared for riots and rebellions, not for patience, persistence, and purpose. And long after the tea had sunk to the bottom of Boston Harbor, its true impact continued to rise, carried by ideas that refused to be silenced. Part 4. By the time the war entered its later years, exhaustion hung over the colonies like a heavy fog. Victory no longer felt close or certain. It felt distant, fragile, something that might slip away at any moment. Battles were won, then lost. Alliances shifted. Promises of freedom were tested daily by hunger, cold, and fear. Through it all, Sam Adams remained steady, even as the world around him seemed to fray at the edges. He had never imagined the revolution as a single dramatic moment. To him, it was always a long test of character. Now that test was revealing strengths and weaknesses across the colonies. Inflation ravaged the economy. Soldiers went unpaid. Civilians grew weary of sacrifice. Some began to question whether independence was worth the suffering. Adams understood this danger more than most. Revolutions, he believed, rarely failed on the battlefield. They failed in the hearts of the people. He threw himself into the unglamorous work of governance. Committees met endlessly, arguing over funding, supplies, authority. Tempers flared. Egos clashed. Adams worked quietly to smooth tensions, reminding delegates that unity was not natural. It had to be built and rebuilt again and again. Where others demanded loyalty, he appealed to shared purpose. He spoke often about virtue, not in a religious sense alone but as a civic responsibility. A free people, he argued, must be willing to place the common good above personal gain. These ideas were not always popular. In wartime, people wanted quick solutions, strong leaders, decisive force. Adams offered patience and principles instead. In Massachusetts, political life resumed even as the war continued. The question shifted from resistance to responsibility. What kind of society would replace British rule? Adams believed deeply that freedom required participation. He supported efforts to expand local governance and public involvement, insisting that independence meant little if power simply changed hands at the top. Privately, he worried. War hardened people. Violence normalized extremes. He feared that the values that justified independence could be lost in the struggle to achieve it. In letters to fellow leaders, he warned against becoming what they opposed. Liberty, he reminded them, was fragile. As peace talks began to seem possible, Adams's attention turned toward the future. The colonies would soon face challenges far more complex than resisting an empire. They would need laws, trust, compromise. They would need to govern themselves. When news finally arrived that Britain was prepared to recognize American independence, there was relief, but also uncertainty. Celebration mixed with anxiety. The enemy was gone, but so was the unifying force of opposition. Old divisions resurfaced. Economic inequality, regional disputes, and political rivalries threatened to undo what war had built. Sam Adams stepped into this new era with the same quiet resolve he had always carried. He continued serving Massachusetts, advocating for strong local rights balanced by shared national purpose. He believed deeply that freedom flourished closest to the people. His views did not always align with those pushing for a stronger central government. He feared concentrated power, having spent his life resisting it. Yet even in disagreement, He sought dialogue rather than dominance. He knew that compromise, though imperfect, was the lifeblood of democracy. As years passed, his role in the early resistance began to fade from public memory. New leaders emerged. New conflicts captured attention. The Boston Tea Party became a symbol taught in simplified stories: angry men, broken crates, dark water. Few spoke of the planning, the restraint, the invisible hand that guided it. Adams did not mind. He had never acted for recognition. What mattered to him was that the idea endured, that ordinary people, organized and determined, could hold power accountable. In quieter moments, he reflected on the path from whispered meetings to nationhood. He thought of friends lost, of sacrifices made, of choices that could never be undone. He did not romanticize the past. He respected its weight. History often celebrates the loudest voices. But Sam Adams had proven something rarer: that calm persistence could move mountains, that leadership did not require a throne or a battlefield, only clarity of purpose. As America struggled to define itself, his influence lingered not in monuments, but in habits of thought, in town meetings, in public debate, in the belief that authority must always answer to the people. The empire had fallen away. What remained was the harder task: living up to the ideals that had sparked the revolution in the first place. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest revolutions. By the final years of Sam Adams's life, the streets of Boston no longer echoed with marching soldiers or whispered plans. The harbor was busy again, ships coming and going under a new flag. Children played where crowds once gathered in defiance. To many, the struggle that had birthed the nation already felt distant, almost unreal. Sam Adams watched this transformation with quiet reflection. He was no longer the restless organizer moving through shadows. Age had slowed his steps, but not his mind. He continued to serve his community, believing that freedom was not something won once and then forgotten. It had to be practiced, protected. The revolution, he often said, had not ended with independence. It had merely changed its form. Younger politicians now filled the public stage, men raised in a nation already free. Some viewed the past as a finished chapter. Adams did not. He worried that comfort could dull memory, that power, once feared, could become familiar, even tempting. He spoke openly about the danger of apathy, warning that the same people who resisted tyranny could someday enable it through neglect. When debates over the Constitution emerged, Adams approached them with the same cautious wisdom that had guided him decades earlier. He supported unity but feared unchecked authority. His insistence on protections for individual rights helped push the conversation toward what would become the Bill of Rights. Once again, he worked not through dramatic speeches, but through persistent argument and moral pressure. He believed that liberty without safeguards was an illusion. In private moments, Adams reflected on the night of the Boston Tea Party, not with pride but with clarity. He understood now more than ever why it had mattered. Not because tea had been destroyed, but because people had acted together, deliberately, with restraint and purpose. It had been a declaration of maturity as much as defiance. Visitors sometimes asked him what it felt like to challenge the greatest empire on earth. He would smile faintly and shake his head. He had never thought of it that way. To him, it was never about fighting Britain. It was about standing firm when principles were tested. About refusing to surrender the idea that ordinary voices deserved to be heard. As his health faded, Adams remained at peace. He had seen the arc of his life bend from frustration to fulfillment. He had watched ideas once whispered in candlelit rooms become the foundation of a nation. Few revolutions are guided by patience. Fewer still by humility. His had been both. When he finally passed, there were no grand declarations. No final dramatic moment. History simply turned the page. But the quiet influence he left behind continued to shape the country in ways few fully recognized. Every town meeting where citizens argued their future. Every protest conducted with purpose rather than rage. every insistence that leaders answer to the people, all carried echoes of Sam Adams's approach to power. The Boston Tea Party remains one of the most famous acts of resistance in American history. Yet its true mastermind was never the man smashing crates on a ship's deck. It was the thinker who understood that symbolism could awaken a people, that discipline could outlast force, and that the strongest revolutions begin not with violence, but with conviction. Sam Adams never fired a shot at the British Empire. He did something far more enduring. He taught a nation how to stand.